I want to share with you regarding the practice of bringing people to Jesus. This activity involves compassion and care on the one hand, and a trust in the Lord to do what is needed in the other. There was a man who was brought to Jesus. As he was preaching in a house, he was actually carried by 4 men, and they even lowered him through the roof down in the very presence of the Lord as he was preaching. I want to read this story. It's recorded by Mark, chapter 2, verses 1 to 12 is the passage. Let's read this story. And again he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. Immediately many gathered together so that there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door. And he preached the word to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. When they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." And some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" But immediately when Jesus perceived in the spirit that they reasoned thus within themselves, he said to them, "Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Arise, take up your bed, and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth, or authority on earth, to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house." Immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went out in the presence of them all, so that all were amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." So let's look at the story. First of all, these 4 men brought this man to Jesus, and that shows, I think, an act of compassion. And I love their determination not to bring him near the Lord, but actually right into his presence, even if they were going to interrupt him when he was preaching. Jesus responded to them doing this by saying that it says that he saw their faith. How can he see their faith? Faith is invisible. Well, he saw their faith by what they were doing. So their activity demonstrated the faith that was in their hearts. The Lord knew this and acknowledged it. Then he does something surprising, I think, to those that brought him and to those around who I think fully expected the Lord to heal him. But he starts by saying, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." Now this immediately caused a stir among the religious leaders who said, "Well, who can forgive sins but God alone?" Exactly. They were still learning who Jesus was. They had no idea, or at least they had not yet come to believe that he would actually be the Son of God. He did have the authority on earth to forgive sins. And it's interesting, the Lord, instead of just saying, "Yes, I have that authority," he said, "I want to show you that I'll prove that I have the authority by saying to the lame man, 'Arise, take up your bed, and walk.'" So the healing, which they were after, and this man certainly wanted, became the proof, according to Jesus, that he had the authority also on earth to forgive sins. It's interesting here, the Lord said, so which is easier? Is it easier to forgive sins, or is it easier to say, "Arise, take up your bed, and walk"? Well, from my perspective, from a human perspective, those are both impossible. So the choice, we can't choose one or the other because they're both outside of our ability. And so we see here this remarkable synergism, this working together of these men with Jesus. They did what they could do so that Jesus could do what he alone could do. We get to work with the Lord. And that was not a very, prominent sort of ministry. How did you serve Jesus today? Well, I was 1/4 of bringing a man to Christ. But always, even if we carry someone like this, Jesus is going to do the heavy lifting anyway. So here these 4 men together worked with Jesus to provide exactly what this man needed, even beyond the healing, to the forgiveness of his sins. Now the Lord tells him to just arise, take up his bed, and walk. And so the man came in through the roof as a paralytic. He walks out the door as one who is healed. And in spite of the Pharisees, the religious leaders' view or questioning about Jesus being able to say this, that he could forgive sins, the crowd was astonished. They were amazed. They glorified God. This is something that came from their soul, from their spirit. I think more was a spontaneous thing. They probably made some kind of noises. They just were, "Whoa, look at this." And he went out in the presence of them all. I think the Lord did that so that everyone who saw him come down one way, saw that he left the other way. And then this wonderful sentence, how it finishes here. As they glorified God, they said, we never saw anything like this. I want that. I want that in community after community. As people bring others to Jesus, he does what he alone can do. They glorify God and say, we never saw anything like this.